For this exercise on simplifying algebraic fractions, we need to remember our work on multiplying fractions together, just simple number ones. So just to remind you, if we've got to do something like 2/3 multiplied by 4/5, when you multiply those together, you do 2 times 4 or divided by 3 times 5. So the answer is 8 divided by 15. Now, what we can do is we can simplify these fractions anytime possible if we have a common factor in the numerator and the denominator. And you can see in this one we don't. So if we had something like 6/9, we could simplify it, and we use cancelling common factors, and you might look at that and say, oh, we can divide the top and bottom by 3, which is one way of looking at it. The other way is to consider it as like we have multiplied to get there. So I would say that if 3 is a common factor, 6 was found by doing 2 times 3, and 9 was found by doing 3 times 3. Now, this is when we have a common factor of 3 and we've decided to divide by 3. That's because we can go from this multiplication and we can kind of go back to this sort of setup. So in this time I'm going this way, but for this one I'm kind of doing it the opposite way. So I'm going to break this up into 2/3 multiplied by 3/3. Now, 3/3 is the same thing as 1. So I'm actually changing this to 2/3 times 1. And if you multiply anything by 1, well, you get the same thing, so we don't need to consider it. So what I can actually do then is just think of, well, 2/3 is my answer. Okay, so 6 divided by 3 would give me the 2, 9 divided by 3 would give me the 3. Now, what some people will do, or most people do, is when we think of this, we can cross out the 3's and we say they cancel out. But it's important to realise they don't just disappear, they actually become a times by 1. And that does help out in problems when things get a little bit more complicated, especially when we're doing the algebra. Okay, so this is what we're doing. We're trying to cancel out common factors, where in this case it was a 3 and we're left with the 2/3. Now with algebra we do exactly the same process. So I look at this one and I look at where the common factors are. And I've got factors of numbers, but I've also got factors which are letters. So if a bit extreme to start with, a bit exaggerated, going back to our previous exercise on products, I can think of 6 as 2 times 3 and x cubed as x times x times x, and that is all divided by 3 times x. Okay, so now you can see up here we cancelled out common factors because they become times 1, so I can cancel one x with another x. So now they don't need to be considered because they're like having a multiplied by 1. And this 3 and this 3 can be cancelled. So now what I'm left with is a 2, so I've still got the 2, and I've got a times x and a times x, so I've got 2 times x times x. But on the bottom I've cancelled everything out, so it'd be like having just the 1 on the bottom, which I don't need to write. So of course I can simplify that further by writing it as 2x squared. Now, some of you will then realise actually it's just quicker to think of it as like the fraction, so the 6 and the 3 cancel, so we divide by 3, top and bottom, which is what we did there, and that will make a 2 and a 1. And the x cubed and the x, so this x cancels with one of those, so that leaves a 2. So we end up with 2 over 1, and x squared is left with no x. So because it's a divide by 1, we don't need to consider it. So we end up with just the 2x squared. So same process. Once you get happy with it all, you get to this stage when you're doing more in your head. To start with, we maybe need to consider to write it all out. So let's have a look at this next example. So I can see the 4 and the 12. So I know 4 is a factor of 12. So I can do, I've got 4 times the x times the y squared. And 12, because I know I'm looking for a factor of 4, I can see 12 is 3 times 4. I've got times x squared, and I've got times y. So now already I can see that the 4 and the 4 cancel. Okay. The x does cancel, so maybe I can think about it if I write another stage out. So I've got x times y squared, but instead of y squared, I'm going to now do y times y, and on the bottom I've got the 3 multiplied by the x squared is x times x multiplied by the y. So one of these x's cancels, one of these y's cancels, so I'm actually left with only a y on top, and that's divided by a 3 and an x is left underneath. Okay, so again, there may be a quicker way, as long as you understand it, would be to understand that the 4 and the 12 cancel, divide by 4, so that makes a 1 and a 3. So there's my 3, the 1 I didn't write. The x cancels with one of these x's, so that becomes 1, so I don't need to write it. This 1, this y cancels with one of those, so I don't need to write that. So I'm left with 1 y, all divided by 3 x. And because it's only 1 y, I've just written y before. But I get to the same point. So whichever method helps you understand best. So again, one more example I would like to go through from exercise 4G.1. We'll look at question 2p. So go for the hardest one. So we've got 10 times a squared, which is multiplied by b and then also multiplied by c cubed. All of that is divided by 12ab squared. So the common factor I can see in 10 and 12 when I'm looking at a factor of 2. So 10 would be 5 times 2, okay, and 12 would be 6 times 2. So I've split that up already. The a squared can be a times a, multiplied by the b, multiplied by c times c times c. Now again, you don't have to write this all out if you understand what's going on. The denominator 6 times 2 for the 12, multiplied by an a, multiplied by b squared, so that's b multiplied by another b. Now we cancel out the common factors, so times 2 times 2, that becomes times 1, so we don't need to consider it. This a here and this a we can get rid of. This times b, this times b we can get rid of. So there's nothing else. I can't get rid of that b because there's one there. I've already dealt with that. So what am I left with? I'm left with a 5, an a, and I've still got all 3 of these c's. So I've still got c cubed. As the denominator, I've got the 6. This is gone, but I am left with a b. So I've got 5ac cubed, all divided by 6b.